Hey everyone, welcome to the Inflammation Nation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy.
One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases. And it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. This is another episode in a different miracle molecule. So we've been talking about a series of what I'm calling miracle molecules, things that just do amazing things inside of our bodies and things that I think you guys need to know about as you think about optimizing your health and wellness or overcoming the health challenges that you're dealing with. Before I get started on the next miracle molecule, which is something called BDNF, maybe you've heard about it, but one of the things that I've been thinking about over the last few years is how wellness is not accidental. And having longevity coupled with a satisfactory quality of life is about managing the inevitable. And what I mean is that, when we're younger, we have that advantage of youth. And as long as the diet and activity level of a young person is reasonable, they really don't have to do too much to not be sick. And maybe that's changing because we've messed up our environment, we've messed up the food supply, oh gosh, that's a whole other bunny trail it could go down. But the bottom line is that as we age, things change. And in a sense, part of that is quite inevitable. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you've heard me talk about how things change once you hit your 40s, roughly speaking. And whether it's the loss of muscle power, speed, strength, and mass, or if it's a decline in your VO2 max, or changes in insulin sensitivity or fat cell behavior, the ugly truth is that we get older, things do change, and they don't change for the better. And so you have to be intentional. And that's not to mean that we just shrug our shoulders and echo the absolutely devastating mantra of, well, you're just getting older. What it means is that we need to be more aware of what these changes are as we age. And then we need to intentionally implement steps and strategies that will prevent or modify or change, resolve, eliminate, compensate, whatever word you want to use for those changes. In fact, I would say that the quote unquote, I'm just getting older excuse is exactly that. It's an excuse. And really, it's a defeatist attitude. So today, this fourth miracle molecule we're going to talk about is this thing called BDNF, and it's all about the brain. Let me read you a short paragraph from the Nature journal called Neuropsychopharmacology. That's basically brain, mind, and medications. So here's the quote. Normal brain aging is associated with progressive cellular and structural changes, cognitive decline, and increased vulnerability to neurobiological disease. And that would be things like Alzheimer's, Parkinsonism, etc. With dramatic growth of the older population, the need to understand the mechanism and consequence of aging on the brain has become critically important. Imaging studies report a smaller prefrontal cortex volume in elderly patients without obvious neurological disease. That was a quote from a paper that was published back in 2002. So, 22 years from when I'm recording this. Now, if you don't know what the prefrontal cortex is, it's the part of the brain that defines who you are. It's the part of the brain that lets you plan or set goals, to make decisions, to implement those plans. And we tend to sum up all of those different functions into the phrase executive function. And that's what the prefrontal cortex does. It gives us the ability to plan and execute, so to speak. And the study goes on to say that in autopsies of the elderly, they see shorter and smaller neurons and a loss of neuronal connectivity in the prefrontal cortex, and that leads to loss of function. But they note that this is happening in the absence of brain disease. So there's not like a disease there that's making this happen. It just happens as we get older. And what's worse is that in the medical community, I'm talking about conventional medicine, perhaps even some aspects of alternative medicine, there's a tendency to confuse what is common with what's normal. So it is common for people to lose brain power as they age. But is that because that's how the system is designed, or is it a consequence of things that happen to the brain? Or maybe it's a consequence of not doing the things that we used to do that kept our brain healthy when we were younger. And if we do those things as we age, can we prevent this non-disease-based changes in brain and functionality? So my thought is that if, as people progressed, say, through their 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond, if they continued to do things that they did when they were younger that kept their brains healthy, we would see far less age-related loss of neuron size and length and connectivity in the brain. And we would preserve that functional connectivity that allows us to maintain a quality of life that is quite often considered uncommon for the elderly. And just to clarify, when I say connectivity, that's how neurons talk to each other, or how different brains or brain regions talk to other brain regions. We might call it functional connectivity. And this is the degree of interconnectivity in the neurons is what allows the system to work efficiently. Like, give me fewer neurons that are better connected than more neurons that are less well connected. But let's face it, when we meet or hear about people in their 80s or 90s who are still mentally sharp, they're still physically active, we're amazed because what we've just encountered is uncommon. Most of us will fall into the trap and the lie of health problems being the natural or normal outcome of age-related decline. And only those of us who are willing to recognize that, to take action as we age beyond 40, will have any chance of being that spry, uncommon 80 or 90-year-old that everyone likes to talk about. So another way to think about this is to ask yourself whether or not you're still doing things that you did in your 20s and 30s. You know, things that were part of a healthy, active life and lifestyle. For most of us, when we were young, we were more physically active. We maybe had a more robust social life. We had a multitude of interests and activities that we pursued. We were probably engaged in some kind of ongoing learning process where we're being exposed to new topics, new information, new ideas. Some of us played organized sports. We learned teamwork, and maybe you traveled and experienced new languages and cultures. When we were younger, we tended to have our ears tuned to the music of the day. I remember, eagerly awaiting the release from my favorite music artists, maybe exploring new music genres. In scientific terms, we would call that an enriched environment, that our life beyond ourselves was rich with other things and other people. But, it's kind of sad. It's, again, common. Maybe it's not normal, but it's common that as we grow up and life places more demands on us, we get married, we have kids, we establish careers, we take on all kinds of responsibilities. The enrichment of our life in that, not to say that being married and having kids and a good career is not enriching your life. I'm not saying that at all. So please don't misunderstand me. But my point is that the focus of our life narrows down, and there's a consequence to that. And that is that we're not exposed to this diverse range of environmental and sensory stimulation that actually is really good for our brain, or even social stimulation. And a lot of times what happens is our mindset changes. We maybe start to see the negative in the world that we didn't recognize when we were younger. Maybe we forget the virtuous and the beautiful. And the net result is that we stop a lot of the things that we used to do and think about life that stimulated the very mechanisms of youth and vitality. In reality, there is an aging process in all systems, and that is inevitable. But the power that has over you pales in comparison to the choices that you make and the habits that you form that can offset and manage this inevitable change and decline. You know, it's always mystified me when in the past I would tell someone that, maybe I ordered a brain scan for them, but, maybe we look at the brain scan and they're kind of amazed, like, my brain has shrunk. That's the loss of neuron size and length I mentioned from the journal article. Depending on the degree of atrophy of the brain, you can actually pick it up on an MRI. And now we have specialized MRI techniques like the NeuroQuant, for example, that actually is designed to measure size and volume changes in the brain that we might associate with things like dementia, including Alzheimer's. But it's always mystified me. Let me get back to my point, that when I show someone their brain scan and tell them that the brain has shrunk, it always mystified me that they would be an older person and they're shocked that their brain had changed. I mean, if you look at me, if you're watching this on video on YouTube, like I have lines and creases in my skin at now 60 years old that I didn't have in my 20s and my 30s. So all I have to do is look in the mirror and I can see the effects of age on my skin. That's obvious to me. So I shouldn't be surprised that just as my skin has changed and aged, so too has every organ and every tissue in my body, including my brain. And once again, just because aging is inevitable, it doesn't mean that you have to roll over and play dead. You can take steps to protect, perhaps even recapture some of the functions that you've lost due to the aging process. Let me give you an example of how dangerous this idea is of accepting age-related changes as normal. I've recently started working with a gentleman. He's in his late 60s. He's had brain complaints that have seriously affected his quality of life. And, first of all, to look at him, he looks like he's in his late 70s, easily. He easily looks 10 years older than his chronological age. But his brain shows changes on imaging that we usually don't see until someone is in their 80s. And he's in his late 60s. And so not only does he have evidence of a brain that has aged too quickly, he's experiencing the loss of functional connectivity that allows the brain to function well despite the aging process. And while I look at his MRI report and think, gosh, this isn't cool because we're seeing an aged brain compared to his chronological age, his MD basically said that this was, quote, normal for his age. And to that I call BS. But I've heard this my entire 30-odd year career, but that is what comes from confusing common with normal. And if he just accepted what his MD had said, well, this is normal, he would not have even pursued the options that might be open to him to, at the very least, protect his brain from things accelerating. So the danger of attributing age-related decline simply to the aging process is that it lulls you into a passive mindset where you simply just accept what comes. And early losses in functionality or health, they get ignored or they get shrugged off as simple aging. And whatever process is involved is left to evolve into greater and greater states of decline that have more negative impacts on the quality of life and perhaps ultimately longevity. So remember that as we age, it is common for people to stop all the things that would otherwise preserve quality of life and would help stem the tides of age, but that doesn't have to be you.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hey guys, thanks for listening and being a loyal subscriber. Wanted to let you know about several important resources that you have available to you as listeners to the Inflammation Nation podcast. The first is my lab shop. The link is in the episode description, and this is a place where you can get access to the very same tests that I use in my clinical practice with all of my personal coaching clients. You don't need a prescription, and the system is set up so that my listeners can access quality labs at direct-to-lab pricing. The second resource is a list of learning courses that I offer for very reasonable prices through my main website. I have courses on gut health, detox, and several that are related to thyroid and Hashimoto's. If you're a true do-it-yourselfer, you need to check these out. They're consumer-friendly versions of the topics that I teach to doctors in my doctor-only functional medicine seminars. The link to the course list is also in the description. And finally, the third resource is me. Even though I'm involved in many different projects, I'm still accepting new clients. Having said that, I do limit the number of people I take on as clients every month so that I can give everyone the level of personal attention that they deserve. So if you have a health issue that you haven't been able to solve on your own or with your current provider team, you can use the link in the episode description or the contact form on my website to email me directly and let me know that you want to schedule an appointment. My initial consultation is an hour long, and it's designed to help me understand the scope and nature of your problems and to make sure that we're a good fit for each other. And finally, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and hit the notification bell so that you know when new episodes drop. Thanks for being a loyal listener, and now back to the podcast. All right, let me get off my soapbox. Let's talk about the next miracle molecule, this thing called BDNF, which stands for Brain-Derived Neurotrophic Factor. BDNF is a small protein. And by the way, this is, clearly it's going to be clearly to me, it's going to be a 2-episode session on BDNF. So I want to just talk a little bit about what BDNF is, what it does, and so on. And then, next episode, we'll talk about some of the research and some of the studies that talk about how we can have an impact on this. So BDNF it's a small protein. It's secreted by the neurons of the brain and the neurons of the peripheral nervous system, right? So it's not just about the brain, it's about the nervous system. But, we tend to think of the brain as being the most important aspect of that. And BDNF belongs to a larger family of proteins called neurotrophins that basically support brain growth and development. They're important regulators of brain circuits. They promote what we call synaptic and network plasticity. That's how the brain learns. It permanently learns different functions, as well as being involved in the process of neurogeneration, not neurodegeneration, but neurogeneration or regeneration and neuroprotection. So essentially, without adequate BDNF, things go very bad for your brain. But the brain isn't actually the only tissue that makes BDNF. We know that immune cells make BDNF when the brain is inflamed or when it's injured, like in a concussion. And this helps to protect the brain and support the repair process. And we also know that when nerve endings, say out in your body, terminate into target tissues like muscle cells or even the cells that line your blood vessels, these target tissues secrete BDNF as a result of being stimulated by the nerve endings. And so what that means is that when your brain sends a signal to an organ like your liver, then your liver makes a little bit of BDNF that then helps the nerve connection remain stable and function properly. And that ensures a strong connection and good communication between your brain and your organ systems. And when I say organ systems, I mean all of them. Unfortunately, we don't have any commercial lab tests to check your BDNF levels. And we don't have any way to check BDNF specifically in your brain. Now, some research labs can measure BDNF in blood for research purposes, but just because we see researchers using certain tests doesn't mean that I, as a clinician, or you as a healthcare consumer, can access the same type of testing. After all, lab testing is a commercial business venture. And so labs are only going to offer labs that a lot of people are going to order that they can make a lot of money on, right? So sometimes we see tests available or being used in research only, and I can't go anywhere to order that, for example, on any of the clients or on myself. So some research labs can measure BDNF in blood, but we don't know how the levels in blood actually relate to levels in the brain. So even if we had a blood test, we can't even tell where the BDNF in your blood has come from because it comes from so many different tissues. So blood levels, if we could measure them commercially, are the aggregate of BDNF being made everywhere in the body, including the brain. And so there's limited utility there, even if a test was available to you and me. And what that leaves us with is doing our best to understand what BDNF is, what it does, and then how we can improve that. So let's talk about some of the things that are associated with, let's call them imbalances in BDNF levels. Number one, there's an association between deficient or low BDNF and neurodegenerative and psychiatric diseases. So we're talking about things like Alzheimer's as the most common form of dementia, but we also see low BDNF in research associated with major depressive disorder, even schizophrenia. We also know that poor BDNF signaling also contributes to abnormal physiology and function of the heart, of the blood vessels. It's involved in coronary artery disease, so think about plaque in your arteries. But it's also dysregulated in very common things like diabetes or inflammatory disorders, certain types of cancers, which is, not my thing. There are people out there that in functional medicine that deal with cancers or people with cancer. I don't do that kind of work. But it's also shown in studies where they look at amplified pain perception. So BDNF dysregulation can be involved in many different things. It's not just about the brain, but anywhere the brain reaches. And that's probably a good way to think about it, is that your brain reaches all of your tissues and cells by reaching its tendrils, if you will, from your skull down through your spinal canal, out into your peripheral system through the peripheral nerves. So it's pretty much everywhere, right? And so we do know, research does confirm that BDNF levels tend to drop as we age. And this is critical because of not just what BDNF does and what doesn't happen when we lose it, but because of where BDNF is concentrated, because it's not present in equal amounts in all places. We know that BDNF is widely distributed throughout the brain, but it's not distributed equally in the brain either. It's particularly well represented in the part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is critically involved in two things that might be important to you. That is learning and memory. And the hippocampus also is involved in control of your adrenal circadian rhythm. It controls your stress chemistry and the stress hormone cortisol. BDNF is particularly well represented again in what's called the neocortex. And that's the part of your brain that develops after you're born. You're born with a primal primitive brain that's really just about survival. Can I go to sleep? Am I going to get some food? Am I hungry? Do I need to poop? Babies' brains are quite functional, but that function is relegated basically to survival. It's not like a newborn can play a game of chess or ride a bicycle. All those things develop later, whether it's language or the ability to control movement, appreciation of art, love, humor, all these different things. It's all part of this thing called the neocortex. BDNF is also concentrated in the cerebellum, which I know I've talked about this before. And usually, if you know anything about the cerebellum, you probably think, well, that's about balance and equilibrium, and that is true. But the cerebellum also has divisions that serve not just movement and balance, but it controls cognition or thinking, and it controls emotionality. And then we have some other structures that, these names might not be familiar to you. The striatum, which is part of the basal ganglia complex, another part of the brain called the amygdala, which is, let's call that your fear complex. And that's a lot of technical terminology, but basically all of these structures that I just named house the major neural networks that make you who you are and serve your quality of brain function and your quality of life. And so what this means is, as we get ready to wind down this introductory episode, and remember, we'll come back in the next episode and we'll talk more about what affects BDNF and then how we can affect BDNF. But what this means is that when we lose it, when we lose that capacity in the brain specifically, we lose neuroprotection and we allow neurodegeneration in the brain circuits that serve core functions. And these things relate directly to quality of life, if not longevity itself, but definitely quality of life. So memory, cognition, the ability to move, balance, control thought, control emotion. And again, that's who we are. And that gosh, you guys are probably tired of hearing me say this, but who cares about longevity if your quality of life sucks, right? You want both. You want to live long and to live well. And if I can't live long, let me live well until my days are done. So without a doubt, BDNF deserves a place in our list of miracle molecules. And so again, what remains then is, again, we'll deal with this in the next episode, is to talk about the strategies and tactics that you can use to support your own BDNF. And in doing so, feel confident that you are harnessing the power that this has to protect your brain and how well your brain communicates to all the systems, organs, and cells in your body. And so that's exactly what we're going to do next time right here on the Inflammation Nation. This podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine in any form or capacity. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of the information in this podcast or any materials associated with or linked to the podcast is at the listener's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional and personalized medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and listeners should not disregard or delay obtaining proper medical advice when a health condition exists and warrants that. And finally, functional medicine is not intended or designed to treat disease, but rather is a natural approach to support restoring health and wellness. The use of diet and lifestyle modifications and nutritional supplementation is supportive for adjunctive care.